Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. We're joined today with a special guest. We have the Current Affairs Editor-in-Chief, Nathan J. Robinson, and we're going to have a conversation about a recent piece that he did on the topic of pacifism, both pacifism in the wake of World War I and pacifism as it's popularly portrayed in our extremely pro-war discourse. So, Nathan, thanks so much for making time to be on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I wanted to start out and just ask if you could maybe talk a little about your what prompted you to write this piece. You mentioned Vera Britton's memoir, but also, I mean, it seems like it's something that periodically, you'll see a lot of discourse around the kind of never again anti-war sentiment in the wake of World War I. I live in the UK, and specifically every Remembrance Sunday, there's this discussion, but it gets drowned out with a sort of intentionally depoliticized take on war. And so I'm always interested in how stridently anti-war stuff from that era is versus the stuff you see nowadays. And so I'm just wondering what prompted you to write this piece, and what did you discover?
Yeah, I mean, I think we, certainly in the United States, there has been a sort of anti-war turn in popular sentiment. I mean, Donald Trump got elected in part running against the Iraq War, and so there is a general shift since the Bush administration that has been very positive in this direction. But I was specifically interested in pacifism as an ideology and the way that pacifism is portrayed, because I'm a big fan of George Orwell, but George Orwell has this passage where he says, to be a pacifist is objectively pro-fascist. And we just did a couple months ago a piece about Sam Harris, and he has a thing about saying pacifism is an immoral ideology. And I've talked to a lot of people actually who even if they oppose particular wars or are critical of wars, nevertheless go, but I'm not a pacifist, right? They qualify it by going, of course I'm not a pacifist, because pacifists are crazy. But I have a reasonable conception on war that examines each war and determines whether it's justified. And there's this kind of, we all have this kind of low-key just war theory. But I was interested in pacifism because I thought, well, I see the argument that is being made, and the argument is, well, pacifism is an ideology that says that no violence is ever justified, and that's crazy because, what if you had to kill one person to save 1 million? That would be really immoral not to commit any violence. But then I read Vera Britton's memoir, and Vera Britton is a pacifist, and she's sort of radically committed to nonviolence, but this whole critique of pacifism as immoral and pro-fascist seems to me to break down, especially when you encounter the pacifists that came out of World War I.
Yeah, it was interesting to me that you mentioned that because I was thinking explicitly how you just framed this. There was a speech during the 2017 general election in the United Kingdom in which Jeremy Corbyn basically said, and I'm quoting from his speech, "I'm not a pacifist. I accept that military action under international law is a genuine last resort and is in some circumstances necessary, but that is very far from the kind of unilateral wars and interventions that have become almost routine in recent times." But it seems to me like that statement it shouldn't be qualified by saying, "I'm not a pacifist." And yet it seems like he's responding to that idea that you've described.
Isn't that funny? Because Jeremy Corbyn, I think we think of as this radical anti-war guy who spent his entire career in politics critiquing imperialism and war, and yet even he feels the need to distinguish himself from the pacifists, because the pacifists have a radical and untenable view. And Corbyn is very, very bold on a number of things, but this is like this one thing where nobody who accepts this idea could ever stand a chance. It reminds me of like what atheism used to be. Like it's, but I think it deserves a second chance. I mean, Vera Britton's memoir is an amazing, amazing book. She was a nurse during World War I who left Oxford to go and tend to wounded soldiers who were gassed and shot, and she lost her loved ones in the war and came out thinking, violence it was insane. She had lost her fiance, the love of her life, who'd just been shot over nothing, and she became a very committed pacifist activist who said, well, I'm never going to raise a hand in violence because I've seen what it does to people. And it seems to me that she's actually a very valuable part of the conversation, yet even people like Jeremy Corbyn feel the need to go, oh, no, I'm not one of those crazy people.
Yeah. Francis, you were going to say something. I kind of cut you off.
No, that's fine. I just, as you said earlier, Nathan, about George Orwell talking about pacifists being fascists. In some ways, I kind of wonder about, like, because I watch now how the liberal, in America at least, the liberal Democratic wing is, I guess they don't want to be confrontational, right? They don't want to confront the fascism at their front door. So, they're becoming, in their own way, like maybe some kind of, like, that's the Orwellian pacifism that I would say would lead to fascism. But of course, that's not pacifist at all. And it's interesting because I was reading through your article, and like it's one of those, like, you really do have to, like, kind of retrain, like, what is it that I know about pacifism, or what is it that I think I know? Because, like, reading through it, it's like, okay, yeah, of course it doesn't mean, I can't, if somebody punches me, you just stand there. Like, you don't have to do that. But it is kind of a, like, I hate war so much that I will do whatever I can to avoid it, short of allowing myself to be completely taken over. And that's kind of how I've been seeing it.
So in the piece, the way I kind of define pacifism, and there are, it's a very contested word, like any word, like democracy, like justice. But I define it by the strength of the person's horror at violence and war, not by a particular set of resolutions to the very difficult question of under what circumstances violence might be justified, because I think there are strong disagreements over that, but by just how much you think war is something that is so revolting to the human conscience that it, as you say, needs to be avoided by any means. Albert Einstein defined his pacifism when he was asked. He said, "My pacifism stems from a belief that the murder of men is disgusting," and that's where Vera Brittain came from too. It was receiving letters from her fiance in the trenches, who was talking about just looking at his friends' corpses in front of him, looking at the people that he loved the most, just dead in a heap of rags and rotting, and when she saw that, and then that happened to him too, and it also happened to Vera Brittain's brother, and she writes about the strength of opposition that this gives you, which is like this is a madness that can't be justified. This is a madness that has to be avoided. There are a lot of people who say things like, well, of course war is bad, or of course it's regrettable. I noticed this a lot in discussions around the Hiroshima bombings, right? Where people say, well, we can debate whether they were justified. And people who justify them say, well, it would have avoided more deaths. Of course it was a bad thing. But I think the thing that distinguishes the pacifist is that they're unwilling to just say, this is a bad thing. It's not just, this is a bad thing. It's like, you have to confront what this actually is, what this means in people's lives. So in the case of the Hiroshima bombings, people who were opposed to it and people who were for it both need to explain what it really means to have a nuclear weapon dropped on a city of civilians, what it really means to have children's flesh burned off in front of their parents' eyes and on a vast scale. That's the sort of thing. The pacifist is intent on confronting the reality of what violence actually means. And I think that is sort of what distinguishes them. Rather than like, how do you resolve the question of when would you fight in a war?
Yeah. Well, something that strikes me about this is, I know this only secondhand, but I used to teach at a creative writing group for veterans and their families when I lived in New York City. And a number of people that would come to the group were retired. So you would get a lot of Vietnam veterans or spouses or relatives of Vietnam veterans, and then periodically some Korean War veterans as well as like young Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who were in school. And one of the stories that I remember hearing was from a woman whose brother was a conscientious objector in Vietnam and actually wound up going to jail. And I think one of the reasons why he wound up going to jail was that part of declaring yourself a conscientious objector in the Vietnam War involved saying that you would not raise a hand to defend yourself, even if it meant you were going to die, even if someone was going to kill you. They defined conscientious objection to such an immense degree that there was basically no way to have a moral objection to violence without saying, I'm willing to not even defend myself in the case of aggression. And so it put people at this basically the only way to achieve that status was to declare yourself, basically create that kind of false impression that you've been portraying in this piece, that the idea that anyone who's a pacifist is basically taking advantage of the courage of other people, if that makes sense. You know, the way that I was making notes on your piece, and I was like, wow, I recognize that John Stuart Mill quote, because it was like on the Facebook profile of every ROTC cadet I went to school with. Because this idea that like, oh, well, you've somehow seen the elephant, you're somehow braver if you say, okay, I'm willing to go and fight in a war, because if you're a pacifist, that means that you're taking advantage of a luxury provided to you by people who are willing to face facts. It's a very chauvinistic impression, but that definitely strikes me as the way that's been portrayed, especially say like since World War II in America, is that the only way you can be a pacifist is literally like, oh, well, does that mean that you're okay with somebody robbing you and beating you to death and you won't even raise a hand in defense? And it's like, I don't think that's what it means.
No. There is, I do want to make one point about that, which is that it is in many ways a very brave commitment. We can say that it's not a moral commitment because it's this kind of freeloading or whatever. But if you really are quite serious about being willing to die without raising a hand to defend yourself, that does require a certain courage. I mean, the Gandhian commitment to nonviolence. I mean, Gandhi was very clear that he had no room for cowards.
Yes.
Right? He wanted people who would march into the bullets. Right? He wanted people who wouldn't run from a confrontation. So it does require a lot of discipline, even if we don't think it's a tenable position morally. I do want to distinguish between even that extreme pacifism and cowardice. But yeah, I mean, but the other thing is that I think there might be room for people like that, in that I think if you are in a situation in which there is such violence endemic to your society, being the one who says, I am not going to be violent under any circumstances, that might have very strong value. It might not be a generalizable principle that everyone could follow, but it might be that having a few people who take an almost irrational and absolute approach is kind of what you need to stir the consciences of others. And I think so I think there are even some arguments in favor of that radical position.
Yeah, and to me, I feel like I should clarify that I absolutely don't believe that to be the case in the sense of saying that it's somehow cowardly. It's just I've seen that representation put forth. Mm-hmm. I've seen it so often where a commitment to nonviolence basically then gets kind of twisted around and sold as, well, then you're just going to make excuses for aggressors. And it's weird because, I mean, both Francis and I were in the military, and for me, I think that there were instances when I was in Afghanistan when I saw people who were wounded as what you might call collateral damage, both because of coalition attacks and because of attacks where like they were, the insurgents put bombs in the road and it blew up a civilian vehicle instead of a military vehicle. And in those cases, I feel like the thing that really struck me, the kind of memory that stays with me, is just the absolute wrongness of it, knowing that it's wrong. And we can couch it in language. We can twist it and say, okay, these things aren't supposed to happen, but they do happen. That's the price. That's just what war zones are like. But when you see it in person, you see that this was done to someone and these people didn't deserve it. You think to yourself, there's no other word I can come up with besides wrong to describe this. And it's weird because as much as the military wants to harp on the sort of ethics of military service and the ethics of leadership, there doesn't really seem to be a lot of room for how do you condemn violence ethically? You basically have to make peace with it, and you can't. And that, to me, that's why I left, because this was an irreconcilable position. And so when I meet people who are committed to nonviolence, like I'm always interested in sort of discussing it, because I do think, in a way, when I read the Jeremy Corbyn speech, he goes on to say that, in a case like the peacekeeping operations in East Timor, that's something he would have supported. And it's like, I can understand where he's coming from in that, where, an international coalition goes in to stop an act of aggression. But I'm very wary because I couldn't call myself someone who's unwilling to defend myself, that I'm that committed to nonviolence. But I absolutely don't believe that unilateral military interventions on the part of the West are doing anything besides something between profiteering and just sort of gross incompetence. And so it's a weird position to take because I'm aware of that kind of cultural current describing nonviolence and pacifism, but at the same time, by your definition, I would consider myself a pacifist.
There is a thing that where everyone is supposed to be, in order to be morally serious, as I say, you have to say, well, I carve out a Hitler exception and I carve out a Western intervention to stop genocide exception.
Yeah.
And then you can have a conversation. But if you don't carve out those, well, then you're letting people suffer, and and your ideology is immoral. So you have to be willing to fight Hitler. But I think what I worry about is by accepting that premise, we do something, which is that we and this is what I think that Vera Britton's commitment where it really resonated with me, because I thought, well, why does she and pacifists like her refuse to answer the question, well, what would you do if the Nazis were coming to power? Why do they avoid even answering the question? Is it, and we know it's because it makes them uncomfortable, but one of the things, but you might say, well, it makes them uncomfortable because they don't have a morally tenable position. Or you might say that their reluctance to deal with the question is actually justifiable and defensible. And what I came to think was that there is a sense in which the pacifist idea is the idea of trying to make violence and war unthinkable. The moment you start having these hypothetical discussions about when it's justified, you are making it very thinkable. You are having a kind of debate over whether something that should be completely off the table, completely horrifying, you are having this debate over when it's acceptable, when the real answer should be that it's never acceptable. And the comparison that I make in the article is almost to rape, right? To say like, well, when is rape justified? Well, that's a horrible question in our mind. To our minds, that's like a question that should never be asked, because like there's no answer to that. And yet with murder, we say, well, there are certain circumstances in which killing is completely justified. Now, obviously, you can construct lots of hypotheticals in which it seems as if killing is justified, but you can construct a hypothetical in which anything, literally anything, is difficult not to justify. Like I give the example, like, well, would you eat one of your children if it saved the other two? Well, if you can say, well, if it saved the other two, you'd have to eat one of your kids. But also, that's just such a horrible question that I'm not sure it profits us morally to even ask it. It kind of debases us to ask the question. And so that's where I think the radical pacifists like Britton are coming from, where they say, well, even having these conversations, when is intervention, when is violence justified? I'm trying to get us to the point where we don't have to have these questions. And yeah, the pacifists can be confronted with 1941 and say, well, you have to fight Hitler, which might be true in the way that there might be hypotheticals where you have to say that some horrible thing is justified. But also the pacifist wants us to think about the 20 years leading up to 1941 and what do I choose to do with my life in order to make sure that these questions never have to be asked.
Yeah, one of my favorite thought process or thought experiments, unquote, is would you go back and kill baby Hitler if you had a time machine? Mm-hmm. It's like, well, why wouldn't you go back even further and just kidnap Hitler's dad for 4 days, the 4 days of conception there, and then, why wouldn't you go back and give Hitler some pointers on art school to get into art college, or there's so many things I can.
You have to kill him.
There's so many things I can do other than go back and murder a baby, and it's like even if it's just okay, look, the time machine only goes to this exact moment in time when Hitler's baby. It's like, fine, I'll kidnap that baby and raise that baby myself and turn him into a fucking accountant then, if necessary. I can't say that.
One choice.
Right. It's there's so many circumstances that lead up to this. It's not just it's Hitler. I mean, if it wasn't for Hitler, World War II would never have happened. Germany was pissed off after World War I. I mean, it was a tinderbox regardless. So it's not just as you said, it's not just the 1941. It's what about 1939? What about 1930? What about World War I itself? What if we went back and we somebody went and pushed the Serbian nationalists.
Get Gavrilo Princip out of the way.
Pushed him out of the way, or like, chucked him in a river and made him swim to the other bank. Like, you don't have to kill anybody. It's history. All you have to do is make a slight change. But no, we got to murder people because that's how Americans think, apparently.
And just as a quick aside too, I mean, I've been doing a little bit of research on that since I've moved to the United Kingdom, and learning about the ways in which the liberal elites of Western European countries tried to accommodate fascism for the longest time before 1939 or before 1941. That I think is the thing that it gets written out of these explorations of like, is violence justified to kill baby Hitler? Because basically it treats all of those failures as though they didn't happen, and say the thing that made the difference was violence. Well, violence wound up being the end of the story, but the beginning of the story was a complete failure of liberal politics to confront fascism. Or at least that's my perhaps simplistic take. But I feel
the war didn't have to happen. It didn't have to, but it did, because, like you said, I mean, there were a lot of times when it could have been stopped, when something could have been done, when things. But it would have required talking. It would have required sitting around a table, doing some hard thinking about things and changing things and making concessions and compromises, and maybe 45 million people, or was that just
100 million?
100 million, 45
civilians. Yeah,
hundreds of 100 million people wouldn't have had to die in a bloody and gruesome war. And we wouldn't be seeing the exact same things be happening now if people would just fucking do the hard work. And that's what I think that's the thing about pacifism, is it's hard work. It's hard work to say these things, to say, let's sit around and talk about this. Let's, I don't want to go to war. Like, it's easy to say, let's just go and bomb Caracas in Venezuela, because that's what we do. That's what America does. If we're showing up, we're bringing bombs and guns. We're going to do something, arm right-wing people down there. One way or the other, it's going to be violence, because it's hard to go down there and just say, hey, what's going on down here? What can we do to help? How can we, exacerbate these problems? Right. Because it's not, one, it's not easy, and two, it's not profitable. And, as everything it all comes back to the bottom line of a shareholder.
I think that baby Hitler thing is so fascinating, because it's true that when you start having hypotheticals of when is violence justified, when you put it on the table, then it becomes such an easy option, right? Because it's an easy way to solve problems, and it turns you kind of stupid, because you stop thinking about other ways to solve this problem, right? And you say, people think, well, kill baby Hitler. And you go, wait, there are a million other things you could do. Now, you might have to be creative. You might have to spend some time. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's good that what pacifists do is they try to take violence off the table, to make it unthinkable. Because if it's off the table, then you treat it as, well, we have to solve this problem nonviolently. We treat violence as if it's not an option, right? And then you say, well, the problem still needs solving, so we have to get really, really creative. It may be much, much harder to solve a problem nonviolently, but we have to do it. And you mentioned the liberal failures in the lead up to World War II. And I wrote about, I did an article a few months back about the way the New York Times covered the rise of Hitler. And it was precisely the way you would expect the New York Times to cover the rise of Hitler. It was laughing at Hitler. It was saying that Hitler was they had a headline in 1924, Hitler virtually eliminated. And you think, there's that virtually, that's what you want to watch out for, is the virtually. And, and constantly saying, well, the the German Constitution is strong, institutions will protect us, and also ignoring the rise of atrocities against Jews. And really, honestly, even when the Holocaust began, burying the Holocaust as insignificant. So not caring very much about the lives of victims. And it's the socialists and communists who are the ones screaming from the beginning about fascism and being totally dismissed. I mean, Fortune magazine in 1937, I've got this wonderful 1930, I think it's 37 issue of Fortune magazine, maybe a little earlier, about Mussolini. And the entire issue of America's Fortune magazine is dedicated to this glowing profile of Mussolini's Italy, because they think, well, could fascism be the solution? And of of course, if you're a leftist during the time, you're going, don't you understand what is going on here? We have to find a way to prevent this. Otherwise, this is going to lead to a civilization destroying conflict. And so that's why it's so outrageous that the gambit that anti-war people are given is, well, now the war is inevitable. Would you fight in it?
Nathan, it sounds like you just don't want the trains to run on time.
I'm indifferent. The trains will get there sooner or later.
Yeah,
they don't need to run on time.
One of my favorite. Anytime a conservative asks me would you kill baby Hitler, I always ask, would you abort baby Hitler? And that seems to kind of turn their brains inside out a little bit.
Yeah, right.
It's like, look, there's like a 9-month period of baby gestation where it's not okay to kill Hitler. You can kill Hitler anytime after he comes out of Mama Hitler, but anytime in there, no. Gotta easy bake him out first, and then we can whack him.
Well, something that I wanted to jump in and ask your opinion on, Nathan, was, so I was thinking about, because it strikes me that you were very affected when you read Vera Britton's memoir, and I felt the same way when I read Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That. I helped do basically like a veteran writing symposium about basically on the centenary of World War I, and I'd never read his memoir, and reading it, I was really, really struck by the kind of the humanity of it, and the way that it can alternate between very, very funny kind of biting humor about what it's like to be just in a dumb, frustrating situation, and then these incredibly poignant recollections of the horrors of war, of watching people die from things like brain injuries where it takes forever for them to actually pass away. And what strikes me is it seems that there was a kind of absolutism about the way people approached the anti-war movement, about anti-war and pacifist sentiment after World War I, and it seems like that's gotten diluted. And I don't think you could make the argument that World War II was less horrible than World War I. But it's strange to me how the most intense, the most almost binary sort of opinions on war that you'll encounter in terms of like the anti-war canon come from World War I. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, whether or not that's been, has it been co-opted, or has it just changed because of the, I don't know, just different dynamics at play?
You can see why that change might occur, right? Because World War I is just such an obviously pointless war, and nobody has a good way to justify it. It just seems like a massive civilizational error where we think, well, this should have been completely avoidable. This was so unnecessary that nobody can come up with a good reason for it, and the deaths are so horrific, and and when you watch things like Peter Jackson has just put together this fantastic collection of old World War I footage from the trenches where he's updated it and put it in color, and it's called "They Shall Not Grow Old" or something. And it's stunning because you have all these really, these normal young men who are very, very relatable, and then and they're in color, and it looks contemporary, and they're just joking around, and then you see then you see the same guys without faces lying on the ground, and it's very, very disturbing. Now you can see, so after World War I, you can go, well, it's very easy to go like, well, clearly this was just such a horrible mistake. After World War II, you can say, well, this is where we have to talk about just wars, because Hitler, that's a righteous war against someone where it's easy to give, as say, this gambit to pacifists, where you say, well, that's a war that had to be fought. And so now your pacifism has to be qualified with, well, I can oppose World War I, but I have to find World War II justified. The reason I think this is a mistake, though, is every war is avoidable at some stage. Yeah. Right? World War II is not inevitable. It's inevitable in 1941. It's not inevitable in 1919. It's not inevitable in 1899. It depends. And so there's this picking of this one point of inevitability. But both of them have the same, that footage would be the same or worse in World War II than it was in World War I. So the horrors haven't changed. But we've got this perceived justification now because there was this clearer moral binary to the war. But I think that moral binary allows us to to avoid thinking about the ways in which getting to the point that was there was not inevitable.
Yeah, and I guess to me, the thing that has been so striking about it is there seems to be a lack of that same kind of reckoning in the aftermath of the obvious failure in Iraq and the failure to prevent the war, and then the disaster that the war became. Similarly, the failure of the war in Afghanistan to accomplish anything, and now its failure to end. It seems to me that that argument that this wasn't just an error of procedure, this was a doomed enterprise from the start. I don't see. I don't want to say that people aren't doing their job somehow, but it does seem to me that the sort of general consensus has not been in like American political discourse has not been that it was an utter and complete waste. It's just, mistakes were made. And that, to me, I feel like gets at the same kind of argument of what you're just describing, that the horror is no different. In fact, you could make the argument that in some ways it's worse because A, there's far less of a sort of like, we had no idea this would happen. And also our ability to precisely cause pain is so much more developed now. And so to me, I guess it's just, it's interesting because I feel like those same voices, whether it's the kind of like the Siegfried Sassoon style voices or the Robert Graves voices or the Vera Brittain voices, would be in my opinion, far more alienated now in the way that we approach how our country and how the West uses violence.
One thing is with the way that we do war now, there's just not as much of a investment from the American people in it. Everybody is not, nobody knows people that are getting drafted into it. You might have a cousin or a second cousin or whatever who went to Iraq who you don't really talk to, but you're friends with on Facebook with them. There's just not that so these wars become just kind of a philosophical issue rather than no, this is a very real and tangible thing that's happening. The indelible thing that sticks with me is in Afghanistan when I was 20 years old, walking into the hospital they had set up there and seeing the civilian, for the civilian Afghans, and seeing a guy who had stepped on a landmine, like a farmer, and what just those little landmines will do to a body. Not even kill him, but he's kind of screwed for the rest of his life because it's Afghanistan, And there is, we're gonna get think pieces forever. We're gonna get Bret Stephens and Max Boot and all these fucking right wing ghouls who cheered it on, and then in the aftermath they're going to sit here and say, well, let's do an after action. What did we learn here? And there's fewer people like myself and Nate and other veterans who went and came back and said, wow, what a waste of my time, what a waste of my brain, what a waste of my body to do this. And we'll sit there and scream and say, let me give you the after action review. This was completely fucked, and we are responsible for this. And there is, we don't have that now. And, it doesn't help that we have that the cult of the warrior is the default of of America, of these Afghan and Iraq vets, to come home and be like, no, you didn't waste your time because you, regardless of the war, you did what you were supposed to do. You followed the orders and you did the things that you needed to do. And it's like, man, we're just selling a really terrible bill of goods to these people. We're doing it to ourselves now. And we're never going to really have that, where we as a country have that, as for a Southern nomenclature, that come to Jesus moment where we're just like, whew, that was not okay, and not in a shoulder shrug emoji New York Times opinion op-ed kind of way, but in a as a society we need to have we need to reckon with that, and maybe pacifism is that kind of direction that we should be heading towards, because it is horrible. That's an image I saw that when I saw that 15 years ago, and that will never be out of my head. Just seeing a man laying in a hospital bed like that is an image of war that's indelibly put onto me, and it's unnecessary. It wasn't even our landmine; it was an old Russian one. But even that, it's just it's still this unending walk of violence that we seem to be on.
Yeah, that's the value of the World War One pacifist writers, as you say, is that they go, well, I'm not going to talk about the philosophical questions, because what we need to talk about first before we get to that is the question of what a landmine does to a human body, because until we understand that, we're not going to know what we're talking about. And this is the way, and America wants to have its wars discussed on philosophical territory. This is the way Vietnam is discussed. Was Vietnam a mistake? What were the the liberal consensus is yes, mistake. But I wrote an article about Vietnam called "What We Did," talking about what it meant for Vietnamese people. And just the reality of that war was for the millions of Vietnamese people who died in it. And Nick Turse has this wonderful book, "Kill Anything That Moves," about what it actually meant, focusing in on civilian casualties. But again, words like casualties really to take you away from what you're actually talking about, which is, you are talking about children and old people. You are talking about having them maimed and murdered in front of their loved ones' eyes. And I feel the same way when, for example, Israel has been killing protesters at the Gaza border over the course of the last year and a half. And there's a UN report that just came out documenting exactly what happened. And hundreds of civilians have been killed, many of whom were not even trying to cross the border. And many others have been, suffered injuries that have, there's a footballer who lost his legs, so he can't play football anymore, that sort of thing. People who really, their entire lives now are going to be characterized by trauma from this one event. But the debate is going to be, does Israel have a right, Bret Stephens' perspective is, does Israel have a right to defend its borders or not? And we risk getting drawn into an abstract discussion of what the level of use of force that is justified under particular circumstances is, without first contemplating what it actually means, what the word force means in the lives of the human beings that have had it used upon them.
Yeah, it's not a semantic argument about borders in Israel and Palestine. It's an argument about people are shooting children, not accidentally, not because there was no other choice, but deliberately making a choice from afar to shoot children.
Yeah, we have to stop looking. We have to stop looking at war like an Excel spreadsheet, basically.
So I have a question then, because and feel free to skip over this if you don't want to talk about this, but I was thinking, because I've noticed this discourse recently in the last week. Obviously, there has been a lot of favorable coverage of Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, or Fort Wayne. I think it's South Bend. It might be Fort Wayne. I can't remember, but he's a city in northern Indiana. Who is an Army veteran and speaks multiple languages, and it seems to give very thoughtful answers, and clearly has read a lot of great books. But I'm very taken aback by the unwillingness to comment on military service as outside of the idea that America has to that the military service is somehow serving a greater good. And to me, I'm really taken aback, because here's a guy who, like me, similar age to me, similar experience to me. I'm also from the state of Indiana, but seems to not have learned anything from being deployed to a war zone, in a war that clearly, even if you're not a pacifist, even if you're not explicitly opposed to violence and war, you cannot look at this and say, "Oh, that's a war that was well fought, that has accomplished something." And so it seems at this point unequivocally a failure, and yet it's just sort of I don't know. I don't want to sound cynical, but it just seems as though it's portrayed as a thing one does to have done it, to have burnished a credential in a way, at least from the liberal establishment, and that makes me. It really weirds me out, because it seems so. Like there's such an obvious discussion to be had. There's such an obvious point to reach, and people are content to just say, "Oh yes, he went to Afghanistan like millions of other people," and that's the end of the discussion.
Yeah, I feel like that. As you said, it's a checkbox to hit. We've had a long period of time when we had people who were being elected that weren't veterans. Well, I mean, there's no excuse now, right? We've had 20 years of war. There's no reason why if you shouldn't have joined up and done something. So yeah, it becomes a credentialing kind of thing.
Yeah.
And in the end, like, yeah, when he's I imagine the tweet you're talking about where he says, I carried a rifle overseas, so I wouldn't have to come home and see people shot by the same rifles at home. It's like, why are you shooting people over in Afghanistan with those rifles too, homie? Like, there's no reason for any of that. And it's a, like, I like Pete. He's, better than most of, my options at the moment. But yeah, there does seem to be and I feel like that's kind of a, an election, like, well, if I'm going to be on the national stage, Lee Carter, who's a state legislator, can talk about the military and how unnecessary some of the things that we do, because he's a state rep. But you can't be running for the president of the United States and be like, oh, by the way, everything I did was bullshit, completely useless. We've wasted time, money, and human lives on both sides on this.
Although I feel like you could. I feel like you could say it. They just won't.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I'm suspicious of anyone who won't. As I say, before they get into, you can say, it's honorable to take risks and such. But if you're not, this is again where I think that a pacifist stance is very not only defensible but kind of morally required. Like, if you're not horrified by the realities of what America's wars do to people, then I'm not sure that I can trust you to exercise power responsibly if it's not clear that you appreciate the toll that these things have taken. If it's not clear that you think, and this is always when I see Democratic politicians praising George W. Bush or John McCain, where you go, well, do you understand how many Iraqi children are orphans now because of these men? Right? And if because I feel like if you do understand that, and you understand what it means to be an Iraqi orphan who watched their parent die, then it becomes very, very hard not to want to talk about that all the time, nonstop. And if you are someone like Pete Buttigieg, who, I mean, I'm sure served for very sincere reasons, but if you don't have a kind of real indignation and revulsion, then I'm not sure you quite understand some of the things that I think it's truly important to understand before we get into the philosophical debate about the justification of the use of force.
Agreed. And to me, I feel like I spent 13 months in Afghanistan, and it is like a pivotal moment in my life in terms of my conception of the world and my conception of right and wrong. And it was sort of like the moment at which I lost what you might describe as a kind of like system trusting idealism. To be honest, I mean, to put it in the most succinct form, I was in a situation in which we were basically denied permission to treat civilians who were wounded by an insurgent bomb, because the justification was we only treat civilian casualties when it's our fault, and like they're probably going to die anyway. It's not our responsibility. And for me, someone who believed, hey, if you join the army and you go and you put yourself in danger, you can be in a situation where you can help and you can make the difference. It was like custom designed to just completely shatter my idealism. And having had that experience at 24, it's been very strange to me to watch the way in which these things are treated as a given. And I feel like that's why I was very interested in this discussion specifically about pacifism, because I mean, not just somebody like Pete Buttigieg, but then when you think about, forgive me, I've forgotten the name. I believe he was a senator from Virginia who at one point was trying to run for president as a Democrat, but he was
Jim Webb.
But he's a Vietnam vet, and he boasted about killing people in Vietnam.
Oh yeah,
and the idea like that if you look at violence as a horrible thing, if you look at war as a thing that must be prevented, that just seems so unbelievably, I don't know, craven to do such a thing. Yeah. But you realize that being treated as kind of like a wow, what a cool guy, what a tough guy. That's a statement of where we are as a society.
Yeah, because even if you did believe that that the war was justified and those deaths were justified, to actually seem to not understand that it's horrible,
Yeah.
like it's shocking. And even someone like John Kerry, right? John Kerry, who came into public prominence through doing something quite heroic, which was exposing war crimes in Vietnam, and then has kind of stopped talking about it, or stopped. He came onto stage as a righteous moral crusader,
Yeah.
And has remained kind of an anti-war voice. But of course, in 2004 he ran on "I'm John Kerry and I'm reporting for duty," and really embraced the service aspect rather than foregrounding the part that was what I think was the courageous part, considering that the country was extremely pro-war at that time,
Yeah.
and it was an act of going against mainstream opinion to say that there were atrocities being committed and that those needed to be called out. And in fact, I was reading a Wall Street Journal review of John Kerry's latest book, and they were saying, it's interesting when John Kerry talks about his Vietnam period, he doesn't really mention all of the stuff, all of his Veterans for Peace stuff after the war. Guess he's probably ashamed of it now. I guess he now recognizes that guess this is a tacit admission that he was making it all up.
Oh, Jesus.
That's what they treated it as, was, well, he must have been making it all up because he doesn't seem very proud of it.
Yeah, and that to me, it's like the same thing when so for a little while, maybe 2 years ago, I got so fed up seeing a lot of people, both that I just encountered online and then people that I knew from the military, praising Pinochet, because I had spent a little bit of time in Latin America, actually when I was in the Army, in Honduras, and had started reading about what the U.S.'s presence in Central and South America had been. And so, knowing a little bit about Operation Condor and a little bit about the Pinochet regime, I was really kind of grossed out when I saw like weird kind of like fawning things, both from people making the glowing eyes memes, or to like more sort of standard boilerplate intellectual justifications for Pinochet's actions. So I read a bunch of books about what life in Chile under Pinochet was like, and the more you read it, the more horrified you are. The more you read it, you find yourself just so appalled. I mean, in one situation, I think there were 2 American citizens who were dual nationals who were protesting in I want to say the 80s, and they were burned to death. They were set on fire and burned to death by the police. And Jesse Helms basically refused to grant their families an audience. And he was taking money from the Pinochet regime. He went down and gave a speech in praise of the Pinochet regime. And you see that, and then to turn around and have, anywhere from Bret Stephens to like more center-right voices say, well, Pinochet was bad, maybe he was a little rough, but what he did saved Chile and it had to happen. You realize just how vacuous that, like how almost negated the moral argument is to them. And you see it here in the United Kingdom as well, when obviously there was a huge amount of outrage about the Iraq War, probably more so than the contemporary discourse in America, but a lot of centrist politicians will just, or people in the media here will just sort of like, oh, yep, here they go again, Joe, talking about Iraq. Oh, why don't you just say, but what about Iraq? As though it's just like the butt of a joke and not something,
so it's trivial.
Yeah, of moral seriousness, yeah.
Well, look at the way Cindy Sheehan was treated in the United States. Right. I mean, she was a woman who, imagine the pain of having your child die, your child that you loved and who was heroic to you and there was everything in your life as a mother, and he dies in the war, for no reason. And all she asked for was an audience with George W. Bush where he could explain to her why her son had to die. Now, I understand that was extremely difficult for him because he didn't want to confront the reality of what he did. But, I mean, everyone should have been on her side in that, right? She had experienced incredible pain. She was very bold. And her son had given his life. The least she deserves is an explanation. And instead, she was treated as a kook.
Yeah.
She became a joke. Right, and she was made fun of, and George W. Bush, the Obamas are his best friend, and photos of him passing a piece of candy to Michelle Obama. You're getting all these, people going, oh, isn't he lovable and childlike? Where you go like, This is a guy who shunned the grieving family member of someone that he caused to be killed for no good reason, and she ended up being totally hounded out of the public discourse and treated as a lunatic. And now he is a celebrated politician, and people look back fondly to the days when we had such dignified people in office as George W. Bush.
Yeah, I think about that, and I think about the paintings, because the paintings of wounded veterans, you can imagine for us, I mean, we can crack jokes about it periodically, but like when you actually break down how it's portrayed, it's just so profoundly disturbing. That it's like, well, here's George Bush. He must be atoning somehow because he's painting pictures of the men who were wounded or killed in the war that he ordered to happen. To me, it just, I feel like there's not been a reckoning of the complete moral collapse that the Iraq War was, which is not to hand wave the Afghanistan war, but Iraq in particular is just a war of opportunism. And I feel like, to bring it back to the discussion of Vera Brittain and of pacifism, I feel as though that all of these arguments that have been honed in service of defeating pacifism, of mocking pacifism, it seems as though they were deployed so aggressively against any critic of the Iraq War. And now that rhetoric has just sort of set in. And that's kind of the default in America. And the Democrats, not to pick on Pete Buttigieg, because obviously there's plenty of others just like him, it seems as though the Democrats are kind of still in like Iraq War reaction mode, in which they're having to say, oh, no, we believe in doing wars. We just want to make sure that we do them correctly so they're successful. And it seems as though the argument of opposing war has been taken off the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think pacifists serve a useful social function. I think they're more important than ever. I mean, especially when you look at something like, I mean, every time I read about what the Defense Department is developing next, it makes me shit myself with fear, because now they're working on autonomous drone swarms, right? Not just drones, but armed drone swarms of hundreds of armed micro drones, and autonomous, so they can make the decision as to whether a target deserves to be taken out. And you think, well, before we get to if we adopt the just war discussion, all we will be discussing is when is it okay to deploy the autonomous microdrone swarm. And I think that we need to not get to that point, because we don't want a world with autonomous armed microdrone swarms. We want a world in which we have eliminated the necessity for that sort of horrifying thing, in which we have stopped the arms race, in which we have walked back the human potential for massive destruction. And there's very little discussion about nuclear arms control these days. There's very little discussion in a way that even after World War II, there was a vibrant discussion of nuclear arms control.
Yeah.
And that's sort of disappeared. There's kind of this acceptance that mutually assured destruction is the way of the world. We've all accepted that we're going to have the most horrifying weapons imaginable pointed at each other at all times, forever, indefinitely. And the reason that I think pacifists have value is they say, like, before we have the conversation as to whether it would be, and in England, I'm sure you remember Jeremy Corbyn was pressured a lot.
Oh God, about Trident.
Where he would be willing to launch a strike, or when he would be willing to launch a nuclear strike. And because he was a little evasive on the question, they're like, and it became a litmus test. Like, will you be willing to kill millions of innocent people? And if you're not willing to kill millions of innocent people under the just scenario, then you're not a morally serious person. Yeah. And I think that has it all backwards.
Yeah. No, it's been madness. I'm going to give Francis, because I know, Francis, you have to jump off the call. I want to give you an opportunity if you have any other questions you want to ask before we close out.
No, I mean, this has been a really great, it's one of those things, like I said earlier, I didn't really know what pacifism meant. I didn't know what it was, and now I get to say, oh, well, I'm kind of a pacifist, and now I can explain that to people, so that when I say that, and some chud with an M16 strapped to his back and wearing a XXL grunt style shirt that says infidel on the front starts screaming at me that I'm a coward, I can politely debate him. And that's isn't that what we're all trying to do here?
It's all about some polite debate. Well, Nathan, I want to give you an opportunity to plug. I know we may not have a lot of audience crossover with current affairs, but you might have some interested people now.
Well, everyone should go to currentaffairs.org and subscribe to our beautiful print magazine, 6 issues a year. We also produce a range of books and our own podcast, and we're very proud of all of them. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for making time. It's been a great discussion. This has been, we sometimes it's just Francis and me yelling about the news, so this has been really enlightening, and I appreciate you making time for us.
Yeah. I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you so much,
Thanks,
Nathan.
Guys.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Just remember, you can follow me at Army Strang, follow Nate at In These Deserts. So this is probably going to be the last episode that we put out for being able to join up at the $10 tier to get our little thank you gift. You can always join up at the $10 tier, anytime after that. Remember, that's going to be a physical zine. You're going to get a little care package and everything. People at the $5 level will get the zine that we're doing digitally, but for tangible stuff, for things in your hand, for crap that's going to just float around your house, $10 tier is where you want to be. We'll be doing that on a quarterly basis. Also, we have our YouTube channel, which you can find at searching Hell of a Way to Die. You can find that in the show notes of any of our episodes as well. Will be down in the show notes on this one. And make sure that you're checking out our t-shirt designs, because we keep putting those out. Nate just recently put out the Dick Gun Coffee Company. So that's, and even if you don't want to do that on your shirt, definitely get yourself a coffee mug of it and pour your favorite Black Rifle coffee or other racist coffee company into it and then throw it directly out the window. So as always, thank you all so much. Get us at patreon.com/hellofawaytodie, and we will talk to you next week.